The night was just like any other, until the flashing lights cut through the darkness. Agent Marcus Walker, an FBI agent with years of experience, cruised down the quiet street, unaware that tonight would change everything. His mind was focused on the task ahead, a case he had been working on for months, but fate had other plans. He pulled over to the side of the road, hearing the unmistakable sound of a police siren behind him. Just a routine stop, he thought. But as the officer stepped out of the patrol car, something didn't feel right. The officer's gaze lingered a little too long, and the way he approached the car seemed off. "Good evening, sir. Can I see your license and registration?" The officer's voice was polite, but there was something in his eyes, something cold. Walker handed over his documents without hesitation, but the officer didn't take them right away. Instead, he glanced at Walker's badge on the seat beside him and froze. "Are you FBI?" the officer asked, his voice faltering just slightly. Walker's hand tightened around the steering wheel. He had been through this before, being stopped because of the color of his skin, the suspicion in their eyes, the doubt in their voices. But tonight was different. He wasn't just another man on the road. He was an agent of the law, sworn to uphold the very system that was now questioning him. "Is there a problem, officer?" Walker asked, his tone steady, but his heart started to race. The officer hesitated before saying, "Step out of the vehicle, please." A sinking feeling gripped Walker's chest. Something was happening here, something bigger than just a routine stop. His instincts told him that what came next wouldn't be a simple exchange of pleasantries. This was something more. But what? The officer motioned for backup, and the situation began to spiral. Walker's mind raced, trying to piece together the signs. But the truth hit him hard. This wasn't just about him. It was about something far deeper, something that stretched through the very core of the system itself. And as the seconds ticked by, one thing became clear. Tonight, everything was about to change. It was a regular night for FBI agent Marcus Walker, one of the agency's most respected agents, known for his sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of justice. He had just wrapped up a long day at the office, reviewing case files, tracking leads, and making calls. The case he had been working on for weeks, the investigation into a corrupt network within law enforcement, had reached a critical point. Walker had spent countless hours gathering information, speaking with informants, and piecing together a puzzle that was bigger than anyone realized. As he drove home on the empty streets, his mind wandered. He thought about the sacrifices he had made for his career, the moments spent away from his family, the long hours in the office. He thought about the world he was trying to change, the battles he had fought, and the small victories he had achieved in the fight for justice. Tonight, he was just looking forward to a quiet evening, to unwind and recharge. But the peace of the night was shattered when he heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren behind him. The flash of blue and red lights reflected in his rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness. He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. Just another traffic stop, he thought, barely paying it any attention. He had been stopped before, more times than he cared to count, usually for some minor infraction or misunderstanding. However, as the patrol car came to a stop behind him, Walker felt a subtle shift in the air, a tension he couldn't explain. It wasn't just another stop. There was something different about this one. He glanced into the rearview mirror, noting the officer stepping out of his vehicle. The man was tall, wearing the typical police uniform, but there was something about his movements that caught Walker's attention. He seemed too focused, too deliberate, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Walker reached down and retrieved his FBI badge from the passenger seat, positioning it where the officer could easily see it. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation. He had learned over the years that staying calm and cooperative was the best approach in any interaction with the police. especially when it was clear they didn't recognize you as a fellow law enforcement officer. The officer approached the vehicle cautiously, his eyes scanning Walker's face before glancing down at the badge. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, his voice neutral but with an edge of suspicion. "Can I see your license and registration?" Walker complied, handing over the documents with a practiced ease. But instead of taking them right away, the officer paused. He looked at the badge again, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. It wasn't just curiosity, it was uncertainty, even apprehension. Walker could feel it. There was something more behind that look. The officer was processing the situation, and in that moment, it became clear to Walker. The officer wasn't just stopping him because of a minor infraction. Something else was happening here. "Are you FBI?" the officer asked, his voice now tinged with a hint of disbelief. Walker's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time he had been pulled over, but it was the first time an officer had questioned his authority like this. His mind raced as he tried to read the officer's intentions. Was this a routine stop, or was something else at play? The officer's question lingered in the air, and Walker felt a wave of tension build between them. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, but a sense of unease creeping into his chest. The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between the badge and Walker's face. Then, without warning, the officer's tone shifted. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he said, his voice firm, but with a strange undertone of urgency. Walker's mind raced. The officer's words were a signal, but of what? The situation was escalating quickly, and the agent could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had dealt with tense encounters before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a routine stop. It was something more, something that threatened to spiral out of control. And as the officer called for backup, Walker's instincts told him that whatever happened next would change the course of the evening and his life forever. The unknown loomed, and Agent Marcus Walker knew one thing for certain. He was no longer in control of the situation. The air was thick with tension as FBI Agent Marcus Walker sat motionless in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that the situation was not as it seemed. The officer's command to step out of the vehicle was sharp and firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Walker's instincts, honed over years of experience in law enforcement, screamed at him to de-escalate, to stay calm. But something in the officer's tone, something beyond the words, told him this wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone awry. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. It was rare for an officer to challenge another law enforcement official, especially one with an FBI badge. In his years of service, he had always found respect from fellow officers. Yet here, in this darkened corner of the city, that respect was nowhere to be found. The officer's demeanor had shifted in a way that made Marcus uneasy. The words, the posture, the look of uncertainty in the officer's eyes. It was as if something deeper was at play. "Step out of the vehicle now," the officer repeated, his voice growing firmer. Marcus, always quick to assess the situation, had already analyzed his options. He could comply with the officer's demand, but the unease in the air told him that this was no ordinary traffic stop. Whatever had triggered this escalation, it had roots deeper than just a routine inquiry. He was an FBI agent, and he knew that he had the right to remain seated, to call for backup, to assert his authority. But that would only escalate things further. And in the dark of night, with no one around, things could spiral out of control fast. He made the decision. Slowly, carefully, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door, stepping into the cold night air. The officer took a step back, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon, though not yet drawing it. Marcus couldn't help but notice the officer's posture. Stiff, as if he was bracing for something that hadn't yet happened. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of authority that came naturally to him. "I'm aware, sir," the officer replied, though his words lacked conviction. His gaze didn't meet Marcus's eyes. It was as if he was trying to avoid eye contact, something that didn't sit right with Marcus. A seasoned officer wouldn't act like this unless something was seriously wrong. Marcus took a step forward, looking at the officer's face, reading the uncertainty etched in his features. "You've got a badge. I've got a badge. Why don't we talk this through?" But the officer wasn't interested in talking. "Put your hands on the vehicle," he ordered, his voice steady now, though still carrying that strange urgency. "Spread your legs." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, a mixture of confusion and growing concern filling him. The officer's orders were clear, but something about this, about the tone, struck him as wrong. He knew he had the right to assert his authority, to refuse to comply if he felt it was necessary. But if he refused, or if he challenged the officer, there was no telling how this could end. Not in this situation, not when it felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. "Is this really necessary?" Marcus asked, trying to reason, trying to understand what was driving this sudden shift in behavior. "You need to comply now," the officer insisted, taking a step closer, his hand still hovering near his gun. His voice was tight, almost desperate. "This is for your own safety." Marcus's mind raced. The officer's words made no sense. For his own safety? The threat didn't add up. The officer was acting as if he had already made up his mind about Marcus. It was almost as if there was something personal at play, something bigger than just a traffic stop. Marcus had dealt with corruption before, but never like this. He had dealt with criminals, with bad cops. But this officer's actions were something else entirely. As the officer moved closer, Marcus's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of another police car pulling up. This wasn't a coincidence. Something was happening here, something that threatened to drag Marcus into a dangerous game he wasn't prepared for. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked again, his voice filled with frustration. But the officer remained silent, his hand now firmly placed on his holstered gun. In that moment, Marcus realized that this wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. He wasn't just dealing with an overzealous cop. He was dealing with something much darker, something that could change everything. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the unmistakable sound of a siren echoed through the otherwise silent street. Another police car screeched to a halt behind Marcus's vehicle, and a new figure emerged from the vehicle, this one wearing a uniform Marcus immediately recognized. It was Detective Sarah Ellis, a colleague from the FBI's local task force. Her expression was steely, eyes scanning the situation with a calculated focus that only someone who had seen their share of high-stakes moments could manage. For a moment, the officer facing Marcus froze. The hand that had been hovering near his holster faltered, and his posture shifted just slightly. Sarah's arrival changed everything. Marcus could see the uncertainty in the officer's eyes, the momentary shift in his demeanor. It was as if the situation had suddenly been flipped on its head, as though the arrival of another figure from law enforcement forced him to reconsider his actions. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Sarah's voice rang out, cool but authoritative. The officer blinked, his face betraying a mix of confusion and frustration. "This is none of your business, detective. Stay out of this." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Sarah was a seasoned investigator, known for handling the most delicate situations with a combination of grace and grit. But what happened next shocked him to his core. Instead of backing down, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she fixed her gaze on the officer. "Actually, this is very much my business. I'm FBI, just like Agent Walker here. And from what I'm seeing, you're acting outside of protocol. Care to explain?" The officer's face went pale. The authority Sarah wielded was impossible to ignore. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words got stuck. He glanced over at Marcus, then back at Sarah, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was clear that he was caught in a lie, or worse, in a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. Marcus stood there processing what had just happened. For the first time in the conversation, the officer seemed unsure of himself, his bravado crumbling. The presence of another FBI agent was enough to break the officer's facade. But it wasn't just that. There was something in Sarah's eyes, a sharpness that left no room for argument, no room for error. It was as if she had already sized him up and found him lacking. "You're out of line, officer," Sarah continued, her voice cold but controlled. "You're either going to explain yourself or I'll take it from here. But make no mistake, you're on the wrong side of the law right now. Do you understand?" The officer's jaw clenched, his knuckles white from the tension. For a brief, excruciating moment, there was only silence. Then he took a step back, his shoulders slumping, as though the weight of Sarah's words had shattered whatever confidence he had left. Marcus could see the officer's facade cracking, but something still didn't add up. Why had this officer, so eager to arrest him just moments before, now become so compliant? What had triggered his aggressive actions in the first place? The officer's demeanor didn't scream of a routine traffic stop gone wrong. It screamed of something planned, something orchestrated from the shadows. "I'm sorry, Agent Walker," the officer mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know who you were at first. I thought you were someone else." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Someone else. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She could smell the lies as clearly as Marcus could. The officer was hiding something, and his feeble apology wasn't going to cut it. "Who did you think I was?" Marcus asked, his voice low but filled with a dangerous calm. His hands subtly shifted toward his holster, just in case. He had no idea where this would go, but he wasn't about to trust someone who could barely maintain their composure under pressure. The officer hesitated again, and Sarah took a step forward, closing the distance. "You have a lot of explaining to do, officer," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Just as the officer began to stutter out a response, the sound of more sirens filled the air. This time, however, it wasn't the blaring sirens of a police car, but the unmistakable hum of a helicopter circling overhead. The atmosphere shifted once again. Something larger, more organized was at play. Something Marcus and Sarah weren't yet fully aware of. For the first time since the officer had approached, Marcus felt his pulse quicken, not from fear but from the growing realization that he was caught in a much bigger web than he had initially thought. And this twist, as unexpected as it was only the beginning. As the helicopter's whirring blades grew louder, the air seemed to thicken with tension. Marcus's instincts kicked in, alerting him that things had escalated far beyond a simple traffic stop. This wasn't just an encounter with an overzealous cop. This was part of something much larger, something deeply orchestrated. Sarah, always composed, kept her gaze fixed on the officer, but Marcus could tell she was processing, analyzing, connecting dots that he hadn't even seen yet. The officer, now visibly shaken, stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just doing my job." His voice cracked, betraying his earlier bravado. It was as though his confidence had evaporated the moment Sarah had entered the scene. But it wasn't just Sarah's presence that unnerved him. There was something else, something more profound, that made him squirm under her gaze. Sarah wasn't buying it. Her eyes, cold and calculating, bore into him with an intensity that made the officer uncomfortable, even though he was supposed to be the one in control. "You're lying," she said flatly, "and I don't like being lied to." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, and he took a step back, his eyes darting nervously. I "I'm not lying," he muttered, but his words lacked conviction. Marcus's mind raced. He had been on the job long enough to know when something was off, and this entire situation felt off. The officer's sudden shift in behavior, his inexplicable aggression, followed by his equally abrupt compliance, was a red flag. It was clear that he wasn't acting alone. Someone else had orchestrated this. Before Marcus could voice his suspicions, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Two more uniformed officers appeared on the scene, their expressions cold and unreadable. They stood behind the shaken officer, but it wasn't their arrival that caught Marcus's attention. It was the dark black SUVs parked just down the street, each one bearing an insignia that wasn't from any local department. It was federal, and that was all the confirmation Marcus needed. Sarah's sharp eyes followed his gaze, and she immediately understood what he was thinking. "We're not dealing with local police here," she said, her voice calm but filled with an undertone of warning. "These people are higher up, much higher." The two new officers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. One of them stepped forward, his hands resting firmly on the belt of his holster. His expression was impassive, but Marcus could see the subtle tension in his posture. He wasn't just a cop. He was someone who had been trained to handle situations like this, to keep a lid on anything that might threaten the chain of command. "Agent Walker," the officer finally spoke, his voice steady, though it carried an unmistakable edge. "You need to step away. This is beyond your jurisdiction." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Beyond my jurisdiction? I'm an FBI agent. I don't need your permission to investigate." The officer's lips curled into a cold smile. "You've been warned." The moment the words left his mouth, Marcus's heart sank. It was clear now that this wasn't some random act of misconduct. The entire situation had been carefully constructed, and they were part of something much bigger. The way the officer had spoken, the presence of the SUVs, and the seemingly well-coordinated actions, it all pointed to a dangerous conspiracy that Marcus and Sarah were only beginning to uncover. Marcus looked at Sarah, who met his gaze with a knowing nod. The message was clear. This wasn't a simple case of police overreach. They were being targeted by a much larger operation, one that was deliberately manipulating events to keep them in the dark. "We need to get to the bottom of this," Sarah whispered, her voice low and urgent. Marcus nodded, determination settling in his chest. The truth was just out of reach, but he could feel it. The web of lies was unraveling, and he and Sarah were about to be caught in the center of it. They needed to be careful. They needed to move fast, because whoever was behind this wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. As the helicopter circled above, Marcus's pulse quickened. The stakes had never been higher, and the danger was closing in. The real investigation was only just beginning. The air was thick with the scent of impending danger as Marcus and Sarah exchanged brief but knowing glances. The revelation that they were being targeted by forces much higher than they had ever anticipated hit them both like a cold wave. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This was no ordinary operation. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy designed to keep them off balance, confused, and far from the truth. "We need to move fast," Marcus said, his voice tinged with urgency as he looked over at Sarah. "They're not going to stop coming after us. We have to figure out who's pulling the strings before they close in." Sarah, never one to be rattled, didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone, quickly scanning through information she had stored. Names, addresses, phone numbers, anything that might link the local officers to the federal players now surrounding them. Her fingers flew over the screen, typing out her own analysis. And with each tap, she seemed to uncover more dots that needed connecting. But every lead felt like it was just out of reach. Suddenly, the rumble of an approaching engine filled the air, followed by the unmistakable roar of sirens. They're not wasting any time, Sarah muttered, her eyes scanning the horizon. The moment they had feared was upon them. The helicopters, once a distant sound in the sky, were now dangerously close, circling above them as though they were being tracked by predators. But this wasn't just about hiding from the authorities. They had stumbled upon something that had caught the attention of dangerous people, and now those people wanted to make sure that they would never expose the truth. "Get in the car," Marcus barked, pulling Sarah toward the nearby vehicle. They needed to get out of sight, but it wasn't just the cops that they had to worry about anymore. The threat had grown far more complex, and time was quickly running out. They raced down the street, their car speeding through the quiet city blocks as the helicopters loomed overhead, casting long shadows across their path. The sirens were growing louder with each passing second, and Marcus could feel the weight of their pursuit pressing in on them. But there was a flicker of something deeper, something more important, pushing him forward. The truth. The truth about who was behind this operation and why they had chosen him and Sarah as their targets. "Do you think they know we're on to them?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern but still composed. She could feel the heat of the chase on her neck, but her mind was focused on one thing: answers. "I'm sure of it," Marcus replied, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "We're not just being chased because of the officer. This is bigger. They're trying to contain us, silence us, but we're not backing down. We can't." As they rounded a corner, Marcus noticed a black SUV parked at the intersection, almost like it was waiting for them. It was too much of a coincidence. Someone was tracking their every move. The closer they got, the more obvious it became. They were being led into a trap. Marcus's mind raced as he fought to maintain control, steering the car onto a narrow side street in an attempt to lose the tail. But as they turned, the unexpected happened. An unmarked vehicle blocked their way, its engine revving in a challenge. Two men in tactical gear stepped out, their weapons drawn, their movements precise. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. They had underestimated just how deep this operation went. "We don't want to do this, Marcus," one of the men said, his voice cold. "But you've left us no choice." Sarah's hand instinctively reached for her concealed weapon, but Marcus put a hand on her arm, signaling her to hold back. They were cornered, but this wasn't the time to escalate things. The true question was, who were these men, and how much did they know? "You've been following us," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "But it's clear you're more than just hired muscle. Who are you working for?" The man smiled, though it wasn't a friendly smile. "You're asking the wrong questions, Agent Walker," he said, his gaze icy. "The real question is, who are you working for?" At that moment, Marcus realized something crucial. This wasn't just a mission gone wrong. They were being caught in a game of high stakes, one in which the rules were constantly shifting, and everyone had their own agenda. The truth was slipping further away with each passing moment, and they were now playing in a world where there were no guarantees of survival. With their cars surrounded and the men closing in, Marcus knew that he and Sarah had one choice left. They had to escape, and more importantly, find the answers before they disappeared forever into the shadows of a conspiracy that spanned much farther than they had ever imagined. The chase had only just begun, and the stakes had never been higher. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus and Sarah remained trapped, their backs pressed against the cold metal of the car, staring down the men who had surrounded them. Every instinct told Marcus that they were seconds away from a showdown, but something in his gut told him that the twist he had been waiting for was right around the corner. The men who had previously seemed like a well-coordinated force now appeared less certain. Their cold expressions were replaced by subtle unease. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice firm but measured. "You don't know what you're getting into." The man in the front, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped closer, his weapon still aimed directly at Marcus. He glanced at his team, exchanging a brief, almost imperceptible look. It wasn't a look of authority or confidence, but of hesitation. Sarah noticed it too. Her mind raced. There was something wrong here. If these men had been tracking them for this long, if they were this close to taking them down, why the sudden uncertainty? Just as Marcus was about to take a step forward, something unexpected happened. A muffled voice crackled through the speaker in the black SUV that had blocked their path. The men flinched at the sound and their leader hesitated, eyes darting to the vehicle. "Abort the mission! I repeat, abort the mission!" The voice came, clear and authoritative. "They're not to be touched." The sudden shift in command was jarring. The men exchanged bewildered glances, but none of them moved to lower their weapons. They seemed trapped in a strange limbo, caught between two conflicting orders. "You're not the ones in charge, are you?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "You've been given orders, but you don't know the full story, do you?" The leader of the men said nothing, his gaze flicking to the SUV once more. Then, as if against his will, he slowly lowered his weapon, motioning to his team to do the same. They were still on edge, but the shift was undeniable. There was more happening here than Marcus and Sarah had initially realized. Suddenly, the doors of the black SUV opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out, his movements deliberate and controlled. His face was obscured by the shadows cast by the streetlights, but there was an air of authority about him that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Agent Walker, Sarah," the man said coolly, his voice steady and commanding. "I assume you're as confused as I am." Marcus narrowed his eyes, instinctively moving closer to Sarah. "Who are you? And what the hell is going on?" The man smiled, a chilling, almost knowing smile. "My name is Robert Dunn. I'm with the agency overseeing national security. What's happening here, what you've uncovered, is far bigger than either of you could have imagined. You've stumbled into something that we can't afford for the public to know, but you're not as far off as you think." For a brief moment, the weight of the revelation hit Marcus like a tidal wave. They weren't just dealing with rogue officers or a corrupt system. They were entangled in a massive, shadowy conspiracy involving the highest echelons of government and military power. The truth had been hidden so deeply, so securely, that even those involved didn't fully understand the scope of what was at stake. "We were just trying to do our jobs," Sarah said, her voice more composed now, but still tinged with disbelief. "You sent people to kill us." "Why?" Dunn's smile faded and he took a step closer. "Because you were getting too close. You were digging into things that you were never meant to find. But you also have a choice. I can offer you a way out. Join us and continue the work you've already started, but with the resources you need. Or you can walk away, forget what you know, and leave this all behind." Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look. The offer was tempting, but it didn't feel right. They had no idea who they could trust anymore. But the truth that had begun to unfold about corruption, about power, was too dangerous to ignore. "We're not interested in playing your game," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "We want the truth, all of it, and we'll expose it, no matter the cost." Dunn's expression darkened, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. "I figured you'd say that." Before Marcus could react, the sound of approaching sirens shattered the stillness. More cars, more agents were on their way. They were running out of time. "You've made your choice, then," Dunn said quietly, backing away toward the SUV. "But you'd better be ready, because now it's not just the cops who'll be after you." As Dunn disappeared into the shadows, Marcus and Sarah were left standing in the middle of a story much larger than themselves. The stakes had never been higher. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to expose a truth that could change the world. And they knew that the battle was only beginning. What do you think would have happened if the officers had taken a different approach with the black FBI agent? Could the situation have been avoided, or was it bound to escalate regardless of their actions? If you were moved by this story and want more powerful, thought-provoking content, don't forget to subscribe to the Arc of Stories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that challenges your perspective and inspires change.